Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little colder than my usual tales. The story of Chernobyl, a Soviet dream that curdled into a nuclear nightmare. Forget the glossy posters and triumphant newsreels. Behind the slogans were secrecy, shortcuts, and human errors that would soon become lethal. The truth is, dropped into Pripyat on the night of April 26, 1986, you probably wouldn't last a day. If you're enjoying this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the variety of places people are watching from. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. In the hush that followed the Second World War, when Europe smelled of smoke and new maps were being drawn with trembling hands, the Soviet Union turned to the atom with the kind of appetite one reserves for a miracle or a weapon. The 1949 detonation of RDS-1, the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb, was less a single thunderclap than a declaration. The state would master the invisible forces of the nucleus for defense, prestige, and, just as insistently, for peacetime electricity. The names of the men who organised that first frantic programme are as stark as the laboratories they came from. Lavrenti Beria pulling strings in the security corridors, and Igor Kurchatov in the lab coat, who would become the public face of Soviet nuclear science. They worked, after Stalin, under a different kind of pressure from Khrushchev's promises and the later, more stolid expectations of Leonid Brezhnev to convert atomic capability into symbols of modernity and productive power. By 1954, Obninsk began sending modest kilowatts to a grateful grid, the world's first grid-connected nuclear power station, and the phrase "the peaceful atom" moved from slogan to policy. It mattered that the Soviet Union could not afford the same supply chains as the Americans. The United States had invested in enrichment plants and in a large civilian industry that could pay for the more conservative, heavy containment types that Western companies favoured. The Soviets, guided by the ministries, Sredmash for the military side and Minenergo for the power sector, made different choices, practical and ideological, that would echo down decades. If the aim was to place electricity where the central plan said it was necessary, to feed industrial complexes in remote oblasts and to bolster Kiev and other Ukrainian industrial centres, then speed, scale and use of domestic ores mattered more than bells and whistles. Natural uranium and graphite were available. Heavy investment in an enrichment was not. The state therefore prized reactor concepts that could run on unenriched fuel and be built quickly in zones the planners selected. These were not merely technical choices, they were political ones, inscribed in 5-year plans and in the budgets distributed from the Kremlin. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, that political arithmetic crystallized into a program of mass construction. Standardized designs, open fields parcelled for power complexes, and atomograds, towns built from scratch to house the engineers and technicians who would operate them. The Pripyat marshes, a sweep of peat and birch, were quietly attractive to planners for practical reasons. The land was available and inexpensive. The Pripyat River offered what hydrologists called a dependable source of cooling water. Rail and road connections could be extended without the political cost of displacing large established populations. Proximity to Kiev, some 2 hours by road, meant a supply of educated technicians and specialists, but in the sense the regime preferred, the community would be close enough for professional linkage and far enough to be architecturally managed, socially moulded, and politically contained. In February 1970, the town of Pripyat was officially founded to accommodate the workers who would staff the new power plant, and construction of the first reactor units began in earnest that same year. The first of those units began generating power in 1970 Unit 2, followed in 1978, Unit 3 in 1981, and Unit 4 in 1983. By the time the 80s leaned toward their middle years, the complex at Chernobyl was a visible node in a vast state project. To electrify, to industrialize, and to display the reach of Soviet technological modernity. That reach had a face and a timetable set by the 5-year plans. Nuclear capacity targets were a headline in the 9th and 10th plans. Ministers set numerical quotas for megawatts to be added, and those megawatts were converted into work orders for design bureaus, for fabrication plants and for regional construction trusts. The Central Committee and the Council of Ministers took a practical view. Mass, repeatable designs reduced engineering risk in one sense and compressed delivery time in another. Prefabricated modules, standardized instrumentation panels, and centrally ordered turbine sets became the lingua franca of a program that needed to look inevitable and efficient. There was also the moral rhetoric. The atom would lift factories and households out of scarcity, which made the allocation of steel, concrete and experienced personnel into nuclear projects look like patriotism. Speed was prized. Reliability, measured as uptime and capacity factor, was rewarded. If that sounds like a sensible calculus, it is because it was. If that sounds like a fragile one, it is because fragility grew where ambition outpaced cautious engineering. From this political soil, the RBMK program grew as a practical compromise between resources, ambition and technique. The RBMK, Reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny, roughly a high-power channel reactor, was the Soviet answer to specific constraints. It could use natural uranium fuel, it permitted on-load refueling so units could run longer between full outages, and its channel-type construction simplified some aspects of manufacturing. The name alone suggests function before form. The system was not intended as a conservative enclosure, but as a working, serviceable industrial machine, meant to be repairable and adaptable at the site. Designers such as Nikolai Dolezhal and teams in the Design Institutes and at the Kurchatov Institute worked within those constraints and produced a reactor that, on paper, offered economy and high output. It was also one born of trade-offs. The RBMK's fundamental architecture diverged sharply from the light water pressurized reactors familiar in the West. The RBMK used a large graphite moderator, an enormous lattice of graphite bricks that would slow neutrons so that natural uranium could fission efficiently, and water flowing through tubes to remove heat. The coolant did not circulate in a single pressurized vessel. Instead, each fuel assembly sat in its own pressure tube, and water passed up those channels to steam separators that fed turbines. The core was sprawling, made of many such vertical channels, and the graphite block stood like a forest of ancient columns, each one playing a quiet role in the chain of reactions. This channel design permitted refueling without a long shutdown. Refueling machines could extract and replace fuel bundles, while the reactor remained critical, a feature that planners valued because it promised high availability and could accommodate the limited enrichment infrastructure of the Soviet Union. But those very features carried consequences that were written into physics, not into budgets. The reactor's moderation and cooling behavior meant it responded to changes in coolant density in a way Western pressurized water reactors did not. In RBMKs, when coolant water boiled and produced steam bubbles, voids, the moderation pattern in the core changed such that reactivity could rise rather than decline. In plain language, the formation of steam could make the reactor more reactive. That counterintuitive property is called a positive void coefficient. Under certain conditions, a small increase in steam production could accelerate the chain reaction, which produced more heat, which produced more steam. It was not an inevitability, it was a characteristic that demanded cautious operational envelopes, conservative control systems, and an institutional willingness to respect limits. Another ill fate lay in the geometry of the control rods and their interaction with the graphite matrix. Control rods are the fundamental mechanical instrument of reactor safety. They absorb neutrons when driven into the core and thus they shut the reaction down. In many RBMKs, including the units at Chernobyl, the control rods had graphite displacers at their tips and boron carbide absorbers further up. When a control rod was inserted, the graphite plug first displaced coolant and briefly increased local moderation before the absorber followed. The immediate effect, for a few tantalizing seconds, was the insertion of a neutron moderator into parts of the core before the absorbing material could do its job, producing a transient rise in reactivity. Engineers later described this behavior with technical precision, and admiring opponents would call it a recipe for a bad moment. At the time of construction and early operation, it was a documented but downplayed design feature. It was a trade-off in a system where every advantage, fuel economy, online refueling, high net output, had a price. The lack of a robust containment building was another strategic choice that revealed the Soviet calculus. Western reactors of comparable age were typically housed in heavy steel vessels and concrete domes intended to withstand overpressure and to contain radioactivity in case of an accident. RBMK reactors, conceived for serviceability and speed of construction, were not built like armoured safes. The reactor cavity was enclosed within a building, yes, but not within the kind of airtight, reinforced, redundant containment the Americans and Western Europeans favoured. That absence was not accidental. It reflected the faith the planners placed in operating procedures and in a culture that believed the machine would be run within its margins. The belief was political as much as technical. In the late Soviet context, admitting that massive, expensive containment was necessary implied vulnerability and cost, two things that sat uneasily with goals of rapid expansion and reusability. How these pieces, graphite moderator, channel tubes, on-load refueling, weak external containment, interacted with the daily life of operators and managers mattered more than any single calculation on paper. RBMK reactors were not inert monuments. They were dynamic, responsive, and in many ways conversational machines. Their responses to low-power regimes, to xenon poisoning, a well-known neutron absorber produced as a fission byproduct, and to changes in coolant density all required operators to be alert to patterns that deviated from the simplified narratives of if temperature goes up, reduce power. Instrumentation in many plants was focused on steady-state operation and on the needs of the grid. There were fewer independent high-redundancy sensors than would be considered ideal. Control systems could be circumvented or had to be manually overridden for operational reasons. That was written into management practice because the plan demanded margins of output and because real life always requires improvisation. Which brings us to the humans who nurtured this machine, who lived around it like a quiet ecosystem that fed on routine and shared confidence. Pripyat was, from the beginning, more than a dormitory. It was a model Soviet town, an experiment in social engineering as much as urban planning. Broad avenues, apartment blocks with balconies, a palace of culture where concerts and lectures were held, schools and kindergartens designed for the children of engineers and technicians. These are the obvious things. There were sports facilities and an indoor swimming pool, shops that offered goods sometimes scarce elsewhere, and the kind of local pride that accumulates when workers feel their labour is a national project. By 1986, Pripyat numbered about 50,000 inhabitants, a close-knit community where the plant's whistles, like church bells in a different age, mark shift changes and feeding times. Work at the plant was organised into shifts that flowed like tides, day crews that oversaw maintenance and longer-term work, and night crews who tended the engines while the rest of the complex slept. The crews were a mix of seasoned engineers who had risen through technical schools and institutes, many recruited from the Kiev Polytechnic Institute and specialist nuclear training centres, and younger technicians who learned on the job. The hierarchy was clear and felt. The plant director, Viktor Bryukhanov, the chief engineering staff, the deputy chief engineers like Anatoly Dyatlov, who carried operational responsibilities, the shift supervisors and reactor control engineers who had hands on the dials. Authority and expertise were often allied with Communist Party structures, a party secretary, the presence of ministry inspectors, and the quiet, ever-present file of regulations that could be interpreted in several ways. Discipline was not only enforced by procedure but by social expectation. A plant worker who questioned a superior risked not only rebuke but social marginalization in a town that wrapped its identity around the plant. The day-to-day reality was mundane in the largest sense. There were boiler rooms and tape-recorded briefings, the smell of oil and hot metal, the clank of wrenches in workshops, and the thin, almost musical hum of turbine hall bearings. Safety training was formal and included dosimetry, protocols for contamination, and drills for leaks or fires. Those drills, repeated enough times, can engender a kind of muscle memory, and a belief in the reliability of ritual. There were also practical makeshift habits, personal valves taped to instruments to remind engineers of previous quirks, notational marks on clipboards that told others how certain gauges preferred to lie, a shared shorthand for the idiosyncrasies of a particular reactor. Experience substituted sometimes for formal engineering conservatism, and that is understandable when the alternative might have meant halting a schedule, asking for funds, or admitting a design oversight to a system that did not reward candour. Socially, the plant's workers were privileged, and the privileges reinforced solidarity. They were paid a little better than comparable workers in regional factories. Their apartments were modern for Soviet standards. Their shops had a steady supply of staples and occasional luxuries. This material comfort, combined with the cultural status of working on the atom, produced a particular psychology. You belonged to something important. In a state that took pride in technological achievement, the operator on the floor or the engineer in the control room saw himself as a small component in a larger, heroic narrative. That narrative makes it harder to be skeptical about the machine you serve. Skepticism, the small, persistent kind that notices a stray gauge or a repeated fault, is not forbidden in a technical culture, but it requires the backing of an authority that rewards caution. In the Soviet setup, that backing was uneven. There was another layer, and it was the invisible one of secrecy and information control. Nuclear matters in the USSR sat across the fence between the ministries and the security services. The language of defense classified many technical details, and an institutional opacity grew around incidents and near misses. Reports of anomalous behavior in other RBMKs or in early tests could be filed in folders and never see broad circulation. That secrecy was meant as protection. It was also a barrier to learning. When a culture does not openly share its near failures, it formalizes an asymmetry in knowledge. Managers keep records, engineers keep gestures in their heads, and the everyday operator receives a distilled, often optimistic version of risk. The interaction between operators and instrument was another point of subtle friction. RBMK control rooms were generous on levers and indicators, a landscape of annunciators and analog dials, where a skilled technician could feel the machine mood, if not always predict its abrupt moods. Yet the machines themselves had behaviors at low power that are devilishly tricky. Xenon 135, a product of fission, absorbs neutrons strongly and can suppress reactivity. Its concentration depends on power history. A reactor that has been at high power and then dialed down can become xenon poisoned and demand withdrawal of control rods to maintain power. That withdrawal leaves the core with less room to maneuver if something goes wrong. Operators learned these rhythms in training and in the quiet hours. They developed rules of thumb and a confidence that these instincts, combined with manual dexterity and team coordination, were adequate. The state taught them to trust the system taught them to trust their hands. And yet, as any historian knows, trust is an economy that can be bankrupted by small overdrafts, an instruction not fully read, a safety interlock disabled for a test, a maintenance excursion postponed because materials were in short supply elsewhere in the plan. The plant had its own fire brigade, medical station, and supplies depot. It also relied on long supply lines for heavy components, turbine rotors shipped by rail from distant metallurgical combines, pumps and valves from specialized factories, control rod mechanisms from design bureaus. Logistics were a continuous arithmetic. Components, personnel rotation, and deadlines. When something had to be deferred for the sake of the schedule, it was not the plan's narrative that bore the cost. It was the operating envelope that narrowed. This is not to say that Chernobyl's people were negligent. They were conscientious, often brilliant, and possessed of a practical ingenuity that kept complex machines running in a world of shortages. They were scientists who loved equations, men and women who took pride in the precision of a waveform or the neatness of a lab notebook. Their children learned to swim in the municipal pool and to sing in choirs. The town staged parades and birthdays and the usual small festivals that anchor ordinary lives. At night, they turned on radios and listened to the weather, and to news from Moscow that was sometimes abstract and sometimes intimate. They were proud Soviets who, like the rest of their countrymen, believed that modernization had a moral arc, that electricity, like education, pushed history toward justice. There is a bitter, almost clinical lesson in how systems that are designed to be efficient can become brittle. Efficiency rewards removal of redundancy. Central planning rewarded conformity. Engineering that prioritizes fuel economy and local manufacture over defensive redundancy will, by design, accept certain vulnerabilities. The RBMK's positive void coefficient, the geometry of its control rods, the absence of a hardened containment shell serveur. These were not accidental malfunctions discovered in the field. They were the outcomes of a system that preferred operational reach to structural conservatism. Within the plant and the town, those decisions translated into a daily choreography of competence and trust. Outside, they were invisible to the grand statements of 5-year targets and the celebratory brochures that showed smiling families in tidy apartment blocks. If you walk, quietly and imaginatively, through the empty avenues of Pripyat as they stand now, or as they stood in the years before 1986 when trees were younger and the children were louder, you can feel how the social life of a technocratic town would support a reactor. Shops that stocked foreign canned goods for the engineer, cultural houses that sponsored lectures on nuclear physics, schools that fed concepts of duty into young minds. The infrastructure of legitimacy is as important as the concrete underfoot. That legitimacy made it possible for operators to make hard and sometimes ambiguous decisions because their world said those decisions were necessary and because there were rewards for meeting the plan. It also made candid critique rare and error reporting slow. When the ghost of a problem arrives, it finds a bureaucracy comfortable with silence. There is, in the quieter corners of archival records and in oral histories, a soft, rueful humour that the workers themselves used to cope. They told jokes about ministry paperwork and the endless meetings, about gadgets that worked only if coaxed, about the strange politics of spare valves and the queues for bread in winter. They called themselves specialists and sometimes privately energetic-y, in a tone that suggested both pride and the slight wariness of men who knew that their tasks carried unusual stakes. That humour is not trivial. It is a human balm that keeps communities intact when the machines require constant attention and when the larger state demands more than any machine can safely give. In the end, the birth of Chernobyl and the choice of the RBMK were, like all historical outcomes, the result of layered decisions, technical and political, fiscal and cultural. The dream was to harness the atom's light to brighten factories and homes across a vast republic. The dream was sincere, bureaucratically framed and materially massive. Yet any dream made by committees and executed under pressure will have seams, and those seams show where trade-offs occurred. The engineers, the planters, the workers and the town all played their roles in a vast performance of modernisation. They were heirs to a post-war logic that equated energy with security and to a political culture that prized spectacle and output. In their daily lives they balanced pride and caution, expertise and improvisation, knowing that a great machine relies, more than any manual admits, on the quiet virtues of its people. As you imagine these things in the so small hours, remember that systems are made of both steel and social expectation, and that sometimes the most consequential choices are not the dramatic ones, but the ones that fold quietly into policy. The choice of fuel, the comfort of an online refueling machine, the decision to keep a containment building lightweight because it is cheaper and faster. These were not abstruse errors. They were decisions made in conference rooms, in planning sessions, at ministry desks, and in the steady, ordinary rhythms of a town called Pripyat whose people loved their jobs, and who lived, for a while, in the neat, shallow certainty that the atom had been domesticated for the benefit of the Republic. The story of Chernobyl begins in those pragmatic choices stitched together into a grand Soviet narrative that promised light and progress, and that under certain conditions was always at risk of producing an outcome the planners had not intended. The rules the Soviets kept for themselves were written in two languages, the language of plans and the language of command. The first was crisp, numerical and proud, Gospelin's tables of megawatts and tons, the 5-year milestones by which ministries were judged, and the neat columns of production that declared a factory or a power station successful. The second was an older tongue, spoken in corridors and in the low voice of a supervisor. Obey orders, avoid drawing attention, never offer a problem without also proposing a solution that fits the plan. Where these two languages met at Chernobyl, they sometimes sang the same song, and sometimes they disagreed. When they disagreed, production almost always won. Power plants in the Soviet Union were instruments of state will. They were supposed to supply electricity for cities, factories, and collective farms. They were visible evidence of the peaceful atom promised by Moscow after Hiroshima had already broken the world's imagination. The RBMK reactor at Chernobyl was presented as one of those machines that proved a socialist modernity, cheap to build because of familiar materials, scalable so that whole networks of plants might be assembled quickly across the vast Union, and flexible enough to feed a planned economy that liked its energy schedules predictable and its output steady. Pride crept into policy. Ambition hardened into an institutional habit. Better to have a plant running and producing than a plant idling with its alarms blinking and its ledger line empty. That institutional habit was embodied in structures. Ministries that controlled both the desks that designed the technology and the factories that built it. Utilities that operated the plants and reported to regional authorities. And a security apparatus that insisted on secrecy and loyalty. The nuclear complex was rarely under a single independent watchdog. Design bureaus such as those around the Kurchatov Institute or the institutes that birthed the RBMK concept answered to ministries like Sredmash, the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which had long been fused with military priorities and a culture of classified projects. Operational control for the civilian power grid rested with Minenergo, the Ministry of Energy and Electrification. Gosplan set the quotas. The Regional Power Authority, in Ukraine, the Kiev-Energo system, handled distribution. The result was not merely bureaucratic complexity, it was a scatter of responsibilities, where one hand did not always know what the other had warned or ordered to be fixed. Safety in such a system could become something of a paperwork exercise. A plant manager who filed the right protocols and met the output targets earned a praise in regional reports. A warning memo that threatened to delay production could be seen as an obstacle and quietly suppressed. To be sure, there were technical people who understood hazards deeply, reactor physicists who knew the implications of a positive void coefficient, engineers who read the gap between a design's ideal and its real behaviour. But the translation of their quiet notes into a corrective program often required a route through months, committees, competing budgets, and political judgments. Warnings could accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a reservoir. Without a release or an independent regulator to dredge them up, the pressure built unseen. Hierarchy hardened this fragility into something practical and dangerous. A plant director's word was effective. Orders given down the chain of command were expected to be followed without public dissent. An operator who questioned a directive risked being accused of obstructing the plan. A chief engineer who raised inconvenient technical doubts might be seen as politically unreliable. The dominant political culture, still formative under Mikhail Gorbachev but older than Perestroika, prized stability and control. Admitting error was admitting weakness. A decisive manager who delivered megawatts was the model to emulate. It is a strange moral economy. Mistake was invisible and costly, prevention visible and expensive. So corrective action often waited until the cost of pause exceeded the cost of breathing. Secrecy made a poor ally of safety. Nuclear matters were treated as secrets of the state, sometimes because they involved weapons or sensitive design details. Sometimes because secrecy functioned as a general reflex. Reports about incidents were routed through channels that filtered their language and often their urgency. Ministry rivalries meant that what one bureau saw as a danger, the other might see as competition. If the designers wanted to defend a particular design, and the operators wanted to keep plants running to meet targets, and the planners wanted more electricity to feed a new factory, the single consistent voice was the one that promised delivery. In such an environment, even when engineers recognized flaws, their voices could be delayed, diluted, or lost entirely in the noise of ministry politics. There were perks to this architecture. A reactor program could be built quickly. Thousands of people could be mobilized to construct a facility in a marginal location, and technical expertise could be concentrated behind powerful ministries. But the costs were subtle and then suddenly obvious. Little concessions became habits, procedural shortcuts, performed repeatedly without consequence, groaned until one day the timbers snapped. Tests, especially those that were inconvenient to schedule, were pushed into windows that meant fewer staff, more tired people, and greater improvisation. A culture in which managers were rewarded for meeting the plan and punished in diffuse ways for delays created incentives that did not always align with caution. It is easy, and sometimes lazy, to place blame entirely on individuals when systems make error inevitable. The RBMK's designers had created a machine with known quirks. The large graphite moderator, water coolant, and the reactor's consequential positive void coefficient could, under certain transient conditions, make the reactor more reactive as the coolant boiled away. The control rods themselves had composite tips that, on insertion, momentarily displaced neutron-absorbing coolant and replaced it with graphite, producing an initial bump in reactivity. These were not theoretical niceties. Some engineers knew them and raised concerns. But changing a reactor's hardware, especially one that existed across multiple units and was tied into the state's industrial momentum, meant bureaucratic approvals, allocations of scarce materials, and a political environment that did not make it easy to say, "Stop, fix it." So the late evening on April 25th, 1986, arrived under pressure that was both technical and organisational. Unit 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was scheduled for a test of an operational safety system that most planners found useful to demonstrate and most managers found inconvenient to delay. The essence of the test was simple enough on paper. If the electrical grid abruptly cut off, could the steam turbine's residual momentum continue to drive the main circulation pumps long enough for the emergency diesel generators to start and stabilise the plant? The argument for such a trial was not about theory. It was about confidence. Problems of scheduling and routine maintenance had conspired so that the test fell to the night shift on April 25th, 26th, after the plant's daytime staff had turned over and while the city of Pripyat slept. Night at the reactor was a world of low, humming light, the hard green glow of instrument panels, and the constant, almost friendly throb of turbines. The crew on duty included the night shift supervisor Alexander Akimov, the senior reactor control engineer Leonid Toptunov, who manned the fluctuating instruments, and Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer who had authority to proceed and was present to oversee the operation. They were experienced men. They were not infallible. The culture that surrounded them had taught them certain rules. Keep the plant running, meet the plan, and do not cause trouble that will be read in Moscow as a failure of management. The test required the reactor to be at a lowered but stable power level. The planners originally intended a reduction to around 700 megawatts thermal, but during the night the reactor's power fell much further than intended. When operators cut power, the core's Xenon-135, a potent neutron absorber produced by fission that builds up when power drops, began to accumulate. Xenon poisoned the reactor, making it difficult to return to the pretest power level. When something like this happens in a machine with a narrow operational margin, the system tends to demand improvisation. That improvisation, under the prevailing organisational pressures and the rhythm of the night shift, would prove fatal. As the clock slid toward 01 Kruk on April 26th, the instruments told a story of an unstable, low-power core. The readings that mattered, neutron flux maps, local power indicators, were not as precise in the RBMK design at low power as they were at full power. Toptunov's gauges, designed and calibrated primarily for normal operation, gave an impression that was not fully faithful to the reactor's inner distribution of neutrons. Dyatlov and Akimov, aware of the test schedule and reluctant to postpone, ordered the power to be raised. To do so, they withdrew a large number of control rods, leaving only a handful inserted in the core, far fewer than regulatory guidelines required. One later inquiry counted only 6 control rods remaining in the core when the test proceeded. Regulations called for tens more. It was a small margin by any measure. In that culture, however, it was a margin that had been accepted by human habit and managerial pragmatism. If the reactors stayed where they wanted, praise would follow. If it did not, there would be a decision to make in the sterile hours of the night. Operators had also, in parts and for reasons the commissions would later explain in bureaucratic language, disabled or bypassed some of the automatic interlocks that would have shut down the reactor at a threshold they deemed likely that to trip spuriously during the test. The logic was not perverse. An automatic shutdown would invalidate the trial and produce political paperwork explaining why a test had failed. Here again, the machine of the plant and the machine of the state had different goals. The former wanted a precise experiment, the latter wanted a successful one that could be checked off the list. At about low 1:23 on April 26th, the test finally moved into its critical stage. Turbines were being run down and the external electrical grid was being removed from the generator's circuit to simulate a station blackout as planned. The kinetic energy of the turbine would keep the feed pumps operating for a short interval until the backup diesels came online. Instead, something else happened. Steam voids, pockets where water flashed to steam, began to appear in the coolant channels. In an RBMK, the formation of steam increases local reactivity rather than decreasing it, and this positive feedback is where a benign pulse can become an avalanche. The reactor's power began to climb, quickly, and in ways the instruments did not immediately make obvious. Localized power surges in parts of the core produced enormous heating, boiling and further voiding. The men in the control room saw the signs of an abnormality. Readings that did not add up, instruments that responded sluggishly or contradicted each other, temperatures that should not have been where they were. The operator at the board tried to plead for corrective steps, but the control parameters were no longer stable in a way human reflexes could easily correct. In a desperate measure to stop the growing reaction, Dyatlov ordered the emergency shutdown, pressing the AZ5 button that commanded the rapid insertion of all control rods. It was the same button any reactor operator would press in the shudder of sudden danger. For seconds it ought to have been decisive, but the design of the rods, with graphite displacers on their tips and water-displacing geometries, had an unfortunate property. When the rods were inserted from the top, the graphite tip initially displaced neutron-absorbing coolant and replaced it with graphite, an effect that produced an initial spike in reactivity in the lower core zones before full insertion took hold. This transient, under the already unstable conditions of the core, was enough to produce an explosive rise in power in a very small fraction of a second. What happened next is the subject of meticulous technical reconstruction and still a kind of slow, incredulous narrative, an extraordinarily rapid power surge, far beyond the reactor's mechanical tolerances, heated channels and fuel elements until they disintegrated. Steam pressure in the sealed upper structure rose and then fractured the reactor's top. The sequence is usually described as 2 violent events at nearly the same time. An initial steam explosion that tore apart the reactor pressure boundaries and ejected the fuel and pieces of the core, and a second subsequent blast that ravaged the remaining structure. The top of Unit 4 was blown off. Graphite moderator was exposed to air. A once encased enormous machine was suddenly an open invitation to the atmosphere. The first people to smell and see the destruction were those who lived and worked closest. At the roof of the turbine hall and in the plant yards, men and women saw fires and steam and heard the terrible acute roar of the explosions, in a kind of shock that combined disbelief with the practiced reflex of who must act first. The Chernobyl fire brigades and the plant's personnel mobilized. It is here that courage and institutional failure braided together. Brave plant workers and firefighters ran toward flames without full understanding of what kind of hazard they were confronting. Graphite, once exposed and red-hot, burns differently and more insidiously than oil or paper. The exposed moderator smouldered and flared, producing vast amounts of smoke laden with fission products. Iodine-131, cesium-137, tellurium, strontium. The initial conflagration was not a single neat burn. It was a spreading, subterranean-feeling fire in a machine built for containment, and every attempt to quench it tended to send plumes of radioactive material roiling into the air. Firefighters arrived within minutes, often in standard turnout gear, their hoses rhythmically hissing as they sprayed water on the turbine hall, on the open reactor, on smouldering rubble that was now dangerously hot and dangerously radioactive. They climbed ladders to the roof. They did not know and were not told the dose rates they were absorbing when they stood on a hot, contaminated slab of graphite. That was not only a failure of information, it was an institutional blindness born of secrecy and of the expectation that danger would be technical, local and controllable. Many of those who climbed and sprayed were breathing in air charged with radioisotopes. Some received doses of radiation in minutes that would later alter their bone marrow and digestive tracts irreparably. The medical response in the first days was harried and improvisatory. Pripyat's small hospital was suddenly a triage centre. Those with burns and respiratory distress were collected and treated as best the local medics could. But most of the clinical team had never seen acute radiation syndrome, and some of the initial symptoms, nausea, vomiting, disorientation, were mistaken for ordinary trauma or chemical exposure. Within hours, seriously ill men who had worked on the reactor top were being driven and flown to Kiev and then to Moscow for specialist care. Moscow's doctors, including those at the Institutes for Radiology and Biophysics, performed the sorts of heroic interventions that medicine allows at its frontier: blood transfusions, attempts at bone marrow support, antibiotics to fight the infections that accompany a collapsed immune system. Bone marrow transplants were contemplated and attempted for some, but the irradiation had been so severe in a few cases that little could be done. The readership of this sort of clinical drama is sober and precise. You cannot mend marrow that is utterly destroyed. You can only hope to support the body for the cell lines to recover, and that is a long gamble. The human toll in those first frantic days is a ledger of immediate tragedy and of delayed suffering. Dozens of plant workers and firefighters were so heavily exposed that their clinical courses collapsed into the classic stages of acute radiation syndrome. Nausea and vomiting within hours, fever and infection within days, hair loss within weeks, and in the worst cases, multi-organ failure. Some of those who worked in the control room or on the station floor died within days or weeks. Others who performed the courageous task of manual valve operation to keep cooling water moving, or who cut away debris to prevent fires from migrating to adjacent reactor units, were runners in a larger logistical effort that cost them dearly in exposure. It is important to note the scale of the response and the mismatches between intent and capacity. The plant's own emergency teams were expert at fighting standard industrial fires, but they had not been equipped for an event where gamma radiation was raining down like an invisible lethal mist. Their suits, their dosimeters, their evacuation thresholds were calibrated to lower risks. Regional authorities struggled to comprehend and coordinate the arrival of military units and of specialised helicopter crews that would drop sand, lead and boron on the burning core in the days immediately after. Those aerial operations were gigantic and dramatic at scale. Crews flew low over the glowing wreckage, hurling tons of material in an effort to snuff the fire and bind the fuel. The material helped somewhat to damp the worst of the combustion. It also redistributed contamination. The scale of these operations, hundreds of sorties, thousands of workers called into service, trucks arriving from distant depots, was colossal. And yet it was also ad hoc. Logistics were improvised on the fly because the planners had not imagined precisely this choreography. Pripyat itself, the town built for plant workers with its bland apartment blocks and neat communal life, was not evacuated that first night. Families slept. Children ran errands in the morning. Later, when local leaders saw radiation levels and understood the scope, the evacuation order was given on April 27th. Buses rolled, and 49,000 people were moved from their homes with minimal explanation and the promise that they would return in a few days. That delay, a policy for the avoidance of panic, but practically a failure of hazard communication, cost many people avoidable exposure. It was also emblematic of a system that first treated information as a risk to be contained, rather than as a tool to be rapidly distributed to protect lives. Even the ways in which casualties were counted and recorded reflected a political caution that would haunt the narrative for years. The Soviet leadership was acutely concerned with perceptions, abroad and at home. International alarms arose not from an immediate admission from Moscow, but from foreign detection networks in Sweden that noticed strange radiation levels in the days following the event. The revelation that a nearby nuclear plant might have had a catastrophic release forced the Soviet Union into disclosure under pressure, rather than under the rubric of its own emergency transparency. In those first weeks, the immediate human cost was both stark and incomplete. Some men died quickly, some died over weeks in wards full of lines and infusions. Some were taken to Moscow for specialist care and lived with scars, physical and psychological. Many more did not die, but would suffer the long uncertain consequences of radiation exposure. Increased cancer risk, disrupted thyroid function from iodine-131, deep anxieties that no statistic can fully grasp. The doctors and nurses, the plant workers who stayed on the roof and the firemen who climbed the ladders, the engineers who shut valves to spare adjacent reactors, those people were the immediate actors in a story that was both heroic and tragically misinformed by omission and organisational misfortune. What Chernobyl revealed in acute form that spring night was not only the failure of a reactor to stay within its design envelope, it revealed a system where motivation and structure, secrecy and pride, bureaucratic reward and tacit fear had together created a condition in which the catastrophe could happen. The machine that had been built to be controlled was put into the hands of people whose instruments were not fully honest at low power, whose rules had been flexibilized by management norms, and whose warnings could be, and often were, roadblocked up the chain of command. When an emergency called for clear, immediate disclosure and the mobilization of civilian knowledge, the structures in place produced instead delay and improvisation. There is a sombre music to that sequence. In the quiet hours of the night, human beings do their best with the information they have, and sometimes the structures around them give them the wrong information or the wrong incentives. The men in the control room were not villains. They were part of a system that taught them to resolve contradictions in favour of the plant's continued output. The firefighters were not reckless. They were courageous, and they lacked the protective cloak of knowledge that would have saved them. The ministries were not conspirators in a melodramatic sense. They were institutions whose rivalries and priorities subtly undermined a coherent safety regime, and yet the technical specifics, the xenon poisoning at low power, the control rod geometry, the positive void coefficient, the disabling of automatic trips for a planned test, must be named because they are the mechanics of what unfolded. These are the things engineers talk about without melodrama. Coefficients, tip designs, timing windows. Here they combined with human choices and organisational signals to produce a single terrible night. The immediate catastrophe was kinetic and sensory. The deeper catastrophe was cultural and structural. The two interact, and the interplay is what made April 25th, 26 not merely the story of a bad night at one plant, but a parable of how complex technologies depend on the health of the institutions that operate them. Long after the flames were subdued and a sarcophagus of concrete and steel would be thrown over what remained, the memory of the night would remain a lesson of interlocking failures. Not a moral tale about trickery or malice, but a sober account that safety is as much about the way organisations think and command as it is about how machines are engineered. In the end, the loss at Chernobyl hung on both. The human narrative and the mechanical narrative were braided in the same tragic fabric. The men who acted that night did so with courage, often without full understanding. They paid for it with their lives and their health, and the state structures paid with the slow accrual of contamination that would cross borders and decades, a reminder that the costs of collective errors harden into consequences that long outlive their bureaucratic causes. On the afternoon of 27th of April 1986, nearly 36 hours after Reactor 4 had torn itself open and poured gamma and particulate poison into the spring air, the buses arrived in Pripyat. They came in a long, languid line, each vehicle a blunt, functional thing, bearing the drab colours of Soviet public transport, engines idling in the town's wide, empty streets, while the people they had come to move waited on pavements and stairwells like actors called back on stage after an abrupt blackout. The official announcement, short, controlled, clinical, travelled through the party apparatus and the municipal telephone exchange, and then into neighbourhood blocks as a cordoned-off instruction. Everyone must go, pack only essentials, take medicines, pets might be taken if possible. You will return in a few days, 3 days. It was a number uttered by officials with calm lips and an enormous untruth at the centre of it. Pripyat was not a village, but a model city for a technical elite, a Soviet dream in concrete and glass, planned around a power station whose very existence made the whole town glitter with both pride and a peculiar structural purpose. Apartment blocks faced one another across green squares. Kindergartens hummed. Shops stocked commodities allocated with bureaucratic care. A culture palace offered dances and lectures. The city had been designed for continuity. Work, school, recreation, a life synchronized to the rhythms of the plant. And in the last hours of 26th April, its normality did not crack like glass so much as unweave. For many, early morning had washed over the city with a flash and a smell. For others, the disaster was news in drip feed, strange weathered dust on windowsills, a radiation alarm in a hospital reading uncomprehending numbers, the distant stubborn roar of fire engines. But nothing that was told to ordinary citizens conveyed scale. That was the point. Information was a commodity to be rationed. The apparatus of secrecy preferred calculation to candour. When they walked out of their homes to the assembly points, Lenin Square included, the community's axis, Pripyat's residents carried what they could. Mothers with infants held formula in a change of clothes. Factory electricians clutched their workbooks. Old men took teacups wrapped in newspapers. Wardrobes were left closed, shoes lined up by doors, shelves left dust-coated, as if pause had been a planned stop in a choreography of return. The municipal workers who packed lists into clipboards moved with bureaucratic efficiency. Names crossed off, relatives recorded, destinations assigned. Buses were numbered, routes were given. The authorities had arranged for temporary reception centres, sanatoriums, dormitories, gyms, in Kiev and towns beyond the immediate perimeter, places where people could be registered, examined and dispersed. The directive was brutally efficient in its administration, deliberate in its omission. There was no use in telling households the radiation levels. There was no sense in releasing the scale of an invisible wind that had already swept villages and fields. The atmosphere in the buses was quiet in the way of people under instruction. That quiet contained fatigue, disbelief, and a pressure like the hush at the top of a diving board. Children slept on laps. Someone's cassette player faintly played a popular song. The drivers followed military-like timetables, moving columns of civilians into the wider Soviet space of hotels, state sanatoria, and reception centres. They were held there for registrations and radiological checks. The phrase temporary evacuation came back and forth, a formal promise. It became, in many households, the shape of denial. People closed apartment doors on a life that would never return the same way. There were logistical decisions dressed as policies. Property would remain in situ, officially under municipal care. The registry of apartments would be frozen. Documents would be kept together at the City Executive Committee. The state performed a tidy choreography for the removal of people and the suspension of daily life, but it neglected the human arithmetic of place. Identity, memory, occupations tied to the plant. Neighbours who had lived their entire lives in block after block. The first night in exile was a kind of limbo. Men who had been technicians sat in state dining rooms, arguing in low voices about reactors and controls. Children tried to sleep on metal cots that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Old women boiled cabbage they had brought and then wrapped it again and again, half expecting to go back. Social networks did not save the feeling of being unhinged. Work certificates, medical records, pensions, the tiny rituals of a city, newspapers, the bus schedule, the scent of the river Pripyat. were all paused, handed into boxes in administrative offices that became sudden guardians of private histories. The bureaucracy was not simply incompetent, it was shaped by a particular political calculus. Secrecy was not only an instinct in those first days, it was a strategy. The Soviet state, still a heavy machinery of image and order, weighed the cost of public panic against the cost of silence. Information that could encourage rumour, that might reach the international press or disturb diplomatic relations, was to be contained. It was not merely vanity, it was fear that the admission of a catastrophic failure would reveal the limits of a system that had promised control over nature itself. Only when Sweden's Forsmark nuclear plant registered unexplained radiation levels on 28th of April, radioactive clouds carried by westerly winds across Europe, did pressure grow to a public admission. Foreign scientists, diplomats and news agencies forced a partial tearing of the veil. When Pravda and Soviet television finally named Chernobyl as a site of a serious accident, the language remained clipped and technical. The apology or confession, if it existed, was private and inadequate. As the hours became days, the zone, the exclusion area that would become the infamous 30-kilometre ring, was formalised, maps drawn with hard lines, posts erected, and a cordon created. It was not merely a military perimeter but an institutional concept, a blanketing of territory that had been suddenly rendered unusable by invisible agents. Villages within that ring were emptied. The first movement, Pripyat's exodus of roughly 50,000 souls, was only the opening measure in a migration that would swell over weeks and months into the resettlement of more than 100,000 people from the immediate circle, and, in the longer term, several 100,000 across Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of the Russian SFSR. Farms were abandoned, schools closed. A harvest cycle was interrupted, and entire livelihoods were parcelled into claim forms and certificates, their continuation dependent on maps and dose rates rather than on the remembered seasons. There is a particular small thing that helps explain the sense of horror beyond the numbers. Personal possessions were, as a rule, left behind. The order to evacuate discouraged retrieval of belongings because movement of people was a priority, and the state did not want to create an illusion of normal return. Public servants took keys and catalogued apartments as if they were warehouses. In some cases, residents were permitted to return briefly to collect essentials, but always under supervision, always with meters to read doses. Those who entered came back with their hair smelling of dust and their hands shaking. Some of the things left behind, the toys in a kindergarten, the textbooks on a school desk with pencil underlines and predictable margins, became evidence of a life cut suddenly short in spontaneity rather than in violence. That silence is the social trauma, not merely lost lives, but lost continuity, the rupture of a shared geography that is the skeleton of memory. The city itself, abandoned and then secured, took on an uncanny aura. Windows stood open, curtains fluttering. A pretzeled, rusting Ferris wheel, the amusement park had been built to celebrate the May Day holiday, loomed in a where that tasted of the comic and the tragic. Shops retained their labels. Television sets sat frozen on channels, radios on frequencies. In the months and years that followed, as nature began to reclaim odd corners, moss on steps, saplings through asphalt, Pripyat became a ruined timepiece telling a story in objects. A child's red school bag propped against a bench, a table still set as if interrupted mid-supper. Tourists and the curious would, decades later, walk these streets with cameras and dosimeters and leave with an uneasy sense that they had stepped into the same Soviet film set that had been abandoned mid-scene. The legal and psychosocial consequences went far beyond the initial flight. Displaced families faced difficulties in registering housing, in obtaining adequate long-term compensation, and in confronting the stigma of being labelled from the contaminated zone. Many bore invisible scars, sleeplessness, fear of the physical, a sense of dispossession deeper than property. If the evacuation was an act of removal, the response that followed was an act of imposition. The state called up a new, extraordinary workforce to remake the place into something secure. They were men and women from every corner of the Soviet Union, soldiers and reservists, miners from Donbass, students, crane operators, engineers, plant crews, and their numbers swelled into the hundreds of thousands. They were given a name: liquidators. The word is bureaucratic, dry. In the mouths of those who knew them it reads as both tribute and indictment. Liquidators were not a homogeneous hero class. They were a patchwork of compulsory duty and voluntary courage, of short-term shifts and assignments that lasted months. They worked in layers: the immediate responders who faced the hottest exposure, the specialists who organised bulldozing and containment, those who built protective structures, and the legions who performed the grim, repetitive labour of cleaning and burying. The mobilisation had a command structure that mixed military precision and scientific improvisation. Boris Sherbina, a seasoned apparatchik, found himself assigned as the head of the government commission to manage the catastrophe. He was the man in suits and short, blunt sentences, tasked with the difficult work of coordinating ministries, military units, and scientific teams. Working alongside him, and in many ways carrying the moral and technical conscience of the operation, was Valery Legasov, a chemist of the Academy of Sciences, who would become emblematic of the collision between truth and power. Legasov insisted, sometimes alone, on the importance of transparent diagnosis of the reactor's failings. His minutes and later his tapes record a mind wrestling with both physics and the political consequences of openness. Their combined authority organised resources, but could not eliminate the improvisational nature of the work on the ground. Techniques employed were both industrial and ad hoc. In the first frantic days, helicopters, Mi-8s and similar types, were sent into the radioactive cloud to drop tons of absorbent materials: sand, boron, clay, lead. The imagery is shocking in its mechanistic simplicity. Pilots, flying through lethal air, released their loads into a crater that continued to smoulder and to give off neutron flux. The goal was to douse fission, where it still flickered, and to attempt to absorb neutrons, to starve the core of the conditions that might sustain further reactions. It worked in part, but at the cost of exposing these flight crews to intense doses. Meanwhile, on the roof and in the immediate rubble, workers, some volunteers, many conscripts pressed into service performed what machines could not. Remote-controlled robots were brought in and promptly failed. Electronics melted or were scrambled by the chaotic radiation. Human hands proved more adaptable. Men equipped with rudimentary shields and rotisserie-like schedules climbed onto structures, shoveled radioactive graphite, and dropped it into concrete dumps. They were timed, often in intervals so short that the work was more akin to a sequence of raids than to ordinary construction. Seconds, minutes, retreat, rotation. The radiation was measured in Roentgens and Greys, and the meters, when they worked, dictated who lived and who did not. The Red Forest, so named because the coniferous trees nearest the reactor turned a dead rusty orange from the radiation, was one of the first landscape tasks. The forest was felled, bulldozed and buried in trenches to prevent the continuous release of radionuclides into airborne dust. Contaminated soil was scraped and bagged, streets were power-washed, roofs were scrubbed, and household goods deemed contaminated were hauled off to mass burial pits, whose outlines remain as cartographic scars in the zone. The scale was enormous. Manpower was the tool available on short notice. Geology, hydrology, and long-term remediation strategies had to be thought through later. The problem of water, the fear that molten fuel might reach groundwater and thus the Dnieper, moved engineers to propose tunnels, heat exchange systems, and other mitigations that required miners and heavy equipment in subterranean perilous conditions. Those underground efforts, the so-called hydrological and engineering responses, demanded miners who were flown in and pushed to dig under extreme conditions. Their task was to control any downward migration of molten materials by creating structures and channels beneath the site. Many returned to cities and villages with warmed hands but cold futures. Many developed illnesses whose causal relationship to radiation exposure was contested, disputed, and disputed again in courtrooms and journals for decades. The truth about health impacts in the medium and long term is one of the most contested legacies of Chernobyl. Acute radiation syndrome in the immediate term killed a cohort of firefighters and reactor staff in 1986. Beyond those deaths, public health effects were heterogeneous. There was and remains a clear and sobering increase in thyroid cancers among those exposed as children, related chiefly to iodine-131 ingestion from contaminated milk and food. For liquidators, epidemiological studies have reported higher incidences of certain cancers and cardiovascular diseases, but the quantification of excess deaths remains contested among agencies like UNSCR, WHO, and independent researchers. The uncertainty does not diminish the lived reality. Men who worked 3-minute shifts on roofs and rotated into trenches returned, bearing illnesses and bureaucratic forms, instead of the full social recognition their labour might have deserved. Recognition arrived in awkward ways. The state awarded medals, badges and pensions. There were ceremonies in halls and in factory yards, photographs with beaming officials, a rhetoric of sacrifice that was ceremonially generous and administratively stingy. For many liquidators, the immediate aftermath brought hospitalizations, medical certificates, and the beginning of a life's bureaucratic entanglement with compensation regimes that would outlast the USSR. The Soviet Union tried to immortalize the narrative of duty and heroism. Later, as the Union dissolved and new national borders emerged, the promises frayed. Some liquidators received additional benefits from the governments of Belarus, Russia and Ukraine. Others faced difficulty in proving exposure or proving the link between their health and the work they had been ordered to perform. The social politics of remembrance evolved unevenly. Monuments rose in Kiev and in other cities, yet clinics and pensions lagged. The phrase "we did our duty" has a double-edgedness when the state does not fully reciprocate. What those tens of thousands of bodies and hours built in short order was practical containment. Trenches, mounds of contaminated earth, cement, and ultimately a structure that would be called the shelter, or, in the language that found its way into foreign press, the sarcophagus. The architecture of concealment was itself an emergency. Designed and erected under duress by engineers and construction brigades, the original shelter was meant as a pragmatic envelope. Heavy steel and concrete plates stitched in place to enclose the destroyed reactor and to reduce gamma flux in the short term. Construction crews worked in shifts. Prefabricated elements were craned into position. Concrete was poured where hands could be present without direct gamma exposure. It was, in many ways, a hurried surgical dressing, necessary to staunch immediate bleeding but not elegant. The sarcophagus had limits from its inception. It was full of gaps, thermal stresses, and joints that would corrode. Its ventilation was imperfect. Water could still move through the rubble and become contaminated. The design did not and could not account for every eventuality, including the slow settling of the debris and the presence of fuel-containing materials, the melted part of the core whose chemistry and position were uncertain and whose radioactivity remained intense. Engineers warned that the shelter might not be a permanent solution. They projected lifespans measured in decades rather than centuries, a fact that would haunt subsequent policy decisions and funding priorities. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, responsibility for the closed site fell largely to Ukraine, a new state with heavy economic burdens. The international community's interest, both humanitarian and strategic, gradually crystallized into a cooperative project. In 1997, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development established the Chernobyl Shelter Fund to coordinate and collect contributions from more than 40 countries and institutions. The problem now was not simply to cover the old shelter, but to create the conditions to dismantle it and to remove eventually the most dangerous materials inside. That required an engineering response on an unprecedented scale. The new safe confinement that rose out of those consultations was, in its way, a late 20th century cathedral for containment. Conceived as a single enormous arch designed to be constructed at a distance and then slid into place over the decaying sarcophagus, it represented a different philosophy. Not to entomb and leave, but to create a controlled, ventilated environment from which decontamination and dismantlement could be undertaken by the remote control cranes and specialized equipment. The contract, after years of design and funding negotiations, was awarded to a Franco-Ukrainian consortium led by Novaka, itself a combination of French construction firms. The arch, roughly 108 meters high, 162 meters wide and 257 meters long, weighing tens of thousands of tons, was assembled in the open, then slid carefully along rails into position during a carefully choreographed operation in November 2016. When the arch finally covered the old shelter, the engineers and politicians who watched saw a practical triumph, an enormous human-made bandage holding in place a dangerous wound. The new safe confinement was not, and would never be, a panacea. It provided a controlled space with industrial cranes and remote handling equipment, environmental monitoring and better sealing against dispersal. It was designed for a lifespan on the order of a century. Its purpose was to enable the removal of the most hazardous fragments and to prevent further dispersal of radioactive dust and waterborne contaminants. Yet questions remained. How to extract and vitrify the fuel-containing mass? How to store thousands upon thousands of cubic meters of contaminated waste? Where should final repositories be sited? How to guard underground water from infiltration? Some of the solutions required technologies still under development. Others required political commitments of funding and sustained oversight that could outlast electoral cycles and shifting priorities. Beneath the triumph of the new structure lay stubborn, technical, and ethical knots. The elephant's foot, a mass of solidified corium discovered deep in the reactor's basements, remained a haunting symbol of the unknown. Its radioactivity made close work impossible for humans. Its geometry and composition made robotic manipulation tricky. Plans to remove the most dangerous materials required equipment that could survive high gamma flux, operations that could be controlled reliably from a distance, and repositories for what would be removed. All of those steps would cost money and time. They would require international patience and national courage. They would also require ongoing monitoring of groundwater and river systems. The Pripyat feeds into the Dnieper, which supplies water to millions. A failure of containment of the wrong kind would have ecological effects that transcend borders. What the successive engineering efforts made plain was that Chernobyl, long treated as an emergency, had become a long-term program. Decommissioning measured not in weeks but in generations. The sarcophagus of 1986 was an emergency solution. The new safe confinement of 2016 is a platform for a much longer, much more careful dismantlement and waste management process that will extend well into the middle of the 21st century. Political regimes have changed. The language of Soviet industrial optimism has withered. What remains is an architecture of restraint and care, maintained by teams of specialists, technicians and bureaucrats who now think in the arc of decades rather than in the language of immediate heroism. There is a social calculus to remember alongside the technical one. The liquidators who laboured in the first months and years exemplified sacrifice for which many received medals and at least temporary recognition. But for many, recognition was incomplete. Benefits were insufficient. Records were lost in the institutional upheavals of the 90s, and the biographical cost, chronic illness, early mortality, fractured families, was sometimes handed back to communities without adequate support. The institutional promise had been paid in the rhetoric of awards and in photographs of men with ribbon chests. The material and moral aftercare was often left to local initiatives and to the hard persistence of those who believed they had been wronged. In the long arc of this disaster's aftermath, there is a bitter irony. A system that once prided itself on mastery of energy and nature produced a wound that required an international cooperative humility to manage. The new safe confinement, paid for by a consortium of states and built by international contractors, embodied a new kind of politics, one in which transparency and multilateral funding were necessary to the very act of containment. It is an architecture that speaks of caution rather than triumph. It shelters the corium as a surgeon might shelter a fragile organ. buying time and space to perform procedures that have no quick, easy answers. Walking through the zone now, decades later, one sees strands of that old life woven into new narratives. Slavutic, the new city built to house many of the plant's evacuated workers, still lives and still remembers its origin in storyboards of relocation and community design. But it is also a standing commemoration of how entire life worlds can be transposed by an accident of technology and policy. The monuments to liquidators in Kiev and Minsk, and the understated plaques in smaller towns across Ukraine and Belarus, testify to a collective memory that is at once proud and wounded. And the sarcophagus, a decaying husk under a gleaming arc, remains a reminder of the way modern states confront their own failures, with urgency, with secrecy, with improvisations that require the very best and worst of human resolve. There is finally a lesson that is not moralizing but factual. Scale matters. The Soviet project of electrification, the RBMK reactor's operating logic, the military-like capability to move men and machines, these things all governed both the catastrophe and the response. When secrecy slowed the first steps of caution, people were exposed. When mobilization was needed, the state produced legions. When expertise could not be found in one ministry, it was summoned from many. What has been built since then, engineering, policy and international cooperation, speaks to the enormousness of the problem. It is an example of how modern industrial societies might bind themselves together to contain a risk that no single actor could absorb alone. If one tells the story in a lower, steadier voice, the kind of voice used when reading late and hoping sleep will come, what one notices is the human scale inside the political and technical edifice. The man who left his slipper at a doorway in Pripyat, the pilot who flew into a radioactive cloud with a load of boron and clay, the miner who dug in a basement to redirect a potential flood. These are the actors in a narrative that moves from error to improvisation, from concealment to international cooperation. The sarcophagus and the new safe confinement are monumental outcomes of that narrative, but they are not endings, they are stages. The zone is still a site of work and attention, a continuing challenge to engineers and politicians, and to the grandchildren of those who first fled. In the silent city, the Ferris wheel turns in rust but not in motion. Inside the arch, robots and cranes and men work slowly. Outside, trees take root where streets once ran. The evacuation taught a generation about the precariousness of place. The liquidators taught the world that human labour could be both heroic and insufficient. And the engineering race to contain the core taught an old lesson anew. Technology can fail spectacularly. And it is both human hands and global cooperation that must then bear the slow, expensive burden of repair. The Soviet dream that spawned the plant produced ingenuity and tragedy in equal measures, and what followed, evacuation, clean-up and containment, has been a long apprenticeship in humility for technocrats and politicians alike. Radiation, after all, is a kind of weather you cannot see. It arrives as quietly as a breath and leaves a map on the landscape and the bodies that pass through it. You measure it in invisible counts, in sieverts and becquerels, and in human lives that turn from ordinary to statistical. In the long nights after 26th of April 1986, the invisible weather of Chernobyl spread across fields, forests, rivers and cities, and it left behind a ledger that scientists, doctors and families have been trying to balance ever since. There are neat lines and messy ones. There are numbers carefully derived and numbers that shout. There is clear evidence. There is uncertainty. Both are true, and both must be carried together like a lantern and its shadow. The clearest, least contestable facts begin with the high and horrific doses given to the men who were closest to the blast and the fire. Firefighters who rushed into the graphite smoke and glowing wreckage, operators who tried to wrest control from a runaway reactor, and the crews who shoveled irradiated graphite and fuel into trucks and dump sites received doses that were, for many, acute and overwhelming. They suffered acute radiation syndrome, nausea, fever, hair loss, collapse of the bone marrow. Within weeks and months, some of them died. The official Soviet tally of early fatalities, workers and first responders who succumbed to acute radiation sickness, ran into the tens. Later international reviews revised some of those figures slightly upward. The human shape of those numbers is precise and spare. Numbers of hospitalizations measured against clinical thresholds, doses recorded in laboratory notebooks and international reports, the grim arithmetic of greys that corresponded to the likelihood of death within weeks. Those were the unambiguous tragedies, an immediate measurable toll tied directly to very high exposures. Beyond that immediate perimeter, the picture diffuses. A far larger population, hundreds of thousands of people in the Ukraine, Belarus and the Russian Federation, received a mosaic of smaller doses, a patchwork of external irradiation from ground deposition and internal exposure from inhaled and ingested radionuclides. For many this meant a dose measured in millisieverts. For others the exposure climbed higher, depending on where they were, what they ate, and how quickly authorities acted. This is where the story grows complicated. You can measure cesium-137 and strontium-90 in a soil sample. You can map the deposition across villages and mountain ranges and count the becquerels per square metre with instruments that sing like small rational birds. But translating that measured contamination into health outcomes demands models, assumptions, life histories and patience. It demands keeping track of milk, of grazing cows, of the speed of the wind, and the way land had been ploughed or left fallow. It demands that you follow a child who drank fresh milk in the days after the accident into adulthood, and try to separate the signal of radiation from other causes of disease. The fact that these are hard tasks is not a failing of medicine. It is the nature of low doses and of human life. The clearest signal, and the one that has produced the least ambiguity in epidemiological terms, is the dramatic rise in pediatric thyroid cancer linked to iodine-131. Iodine-131, with its frantic 8-day half-life, was the messenger that mattered most in the weeks immediately after the release because it concentrates in the thyroid. Children whose growing bodies prefer iodine were especially vulnerable. In areas where radioactive iodine settled on pastures and into milk, the thyroids of infants and small children absorbed dangerous doses. The result was a rise, sharp, localized and temporally tied to the accident, in cases of thyroid cancer among those young people. Data collected from Belarus, Ukraine and parts of Russia show an incidence that rose steeply through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. A small cancer that was suddenly hundreds or thousands of times more frequent than expected for the age group in the baseline era. By the early years of the 21st century, international assessments, notably those coordinated by the United Nations agencies and the Chernobyl Forum, had accepted that several thousand cases of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents could be attributed to the accident. Survival rates for many of these patients, once treated, have been high. Surgeries and lifelong monitoring became the new normal for those whose thyroids were scarred by that short-lived isotope. Iodine-131 did not kill in the same acute manner as the gamma storms that took the lives of firefighters. It wrote its story slowly into the tissue of young necks, and it wrote it predominantly in one place and among one cohort, children. Beyond the thyroid, the landscape of long-term cancers and non-cancer diseases is filled with qualifying sentences. The total number of excess cancer deaths attributable to Chernobyl is a subject where methodology and politics braid themselves into argument. Official international projects that pooled expert judgment, UNSCER, the World Health Organization, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, later gathered under the Chernobyl Forum umbrella, tended toward relatively modest aggregate estimates for the most exposed populations, perhaps on the order of a few thousand eventual cancer deaths in the most affected groups over many decades, concentrated among recovery workers and those who received higher doses. Independent researchers, advocacy groups, and some national studies, using different models or broader inclusion criteria, have produced estimates that are orders of magnitude larger. The discrepancies arise from decisions about which populations to include, how to model cancer risk at low doses, how to account for migration and baseline disease trends, and whether to include non-fatal illnesses and psychosocial morbidity in the total burden. It is worth saying plainly that the science of low-dose radiation epidemiology is an uneven and contested field. The most widely used model for estimating excess cancer risk at low doses is the linear no-threshold model, the LNT, which extrapolates a straight line from high-dose observations down to zero, implying that any added dose, however small, carries some incremental risk. Many authorities use LNT as the basis for regulation because it is conservative. It errs on the side of caution. Others argue that at very low doses the slope of risk is flatter, or even null, because of biological repair mechanisms or statistical noise. Trials, cohort studies, and meta-analyses of Chernobyl-exposed groups show small increases in certain cancers among recovery workers, and some evidence of elevated leukemia risk. But for the wider public, the signal, apart from thyroid cancer in children, is weak and often indistinguishable from background variation. Research is further hampered by incomplete dose reconstructions, poor record keeping in the immediate months after the accident, migration that scatters populations to other regions, and social stressors, poverty, disrupted healthcare, alcohol and tobacco use, that also influence disease patterns. In short, the further you move away from the high-dose cases, the foggier the picture becomes. The environment wears radiation differently than bodies. It stores and releases it in seasons and fires and floods. The isotopes that mattered were not all the same. Iodine-131 left quickly, but left a clear signature on the thyroids of the vulnerable. Cesium-137, with a half-life of about 30 years, became the slow, patient contaminant of soils and ecosystems. Strontium-90, chemically akin to calcium, found ways into bones and milk. Plutonium and other transuranics were deposited in microscopic hot particles that posed a localized long-term hazard. Across the contaminated belt, northwestern Ukraine, most of Belarus, and parts of western Russia, soils, forests and waterways took on new radio ecologies. The nearest wood, the red forest, where pine trees turned the colour of rust and then died in the first weeks, was cut, compressed and buried as a hazardous mass. That crimson stand became both an emblem and a locus of clean-up. Mounds of soil, stacks of felled trees, the smell of burnt sap and metal. Beyond the exclusion zone, the countryside held pockets where cesium still binds to organic soils, and where mushrooms and wild game can carry levels of radioactivity far above what regulators consider safe. The water systems worried scientists and politicians alike. Rivers, the Pripyat that runs past the reactor, and downstream the Dnieper that feeds reservoirs into which cities pour their drinking water, posed the spectre of hydrological transport of radionuclides. Sediment moves, floods erode, shoreline soils exchange with currents. Engineers worried over reservoirs and dams, over the potential that floods or changing land use could remobilize buried radioactivity. The practical responses were a mixture of engineering and agronomy, ban grazing where contamination was high, change feeding practices to prevent contaminated milk, lime soils, or add potassium to reduce plant uptake of cesium, scrape and store topsoil in places where agriculture could not wait, and, in extreme cases, remove material to controlled storage. None of these measures were simple or cheap. Many were temporary, many were partial. Some practices created new waste management challenges, a concentrated pile of contaminated topsoil that had to be stored and guarded for generations. The exclusion zone itself has become a laboratory for long-term observation. For decades, teams of biologists, ecologists and health scientists have walked its roads with instruments, filming deer and wolves, recording the patterns of bird migration, taking soil cores and measuring downward migration of cesium. In one of those paradoxes that historians like to linger over, the absence of people has allowed a thriving of large mammals in parts of the zone. The return of wildlife has been documented with some astonishment, but the story is qualified. Biologists also report reduced fertility in some species, increased cataracts in birds, and subtle genetic markers in some populations. The material truth is not a tidy moral. Where humans retreated, animals came back. Where animals came back, they carried the imprint of contamination. The zone is both a ruin and an unintended sanctuary. its message about resilience rings through with melancholy. To follow the threads of contamination and health has required a global ensemble of monitoring programs. The IAEA sent missions, UNSCR produced assessments. The Chernobyl Forum in the early 2000s attempted a comprehensive synthesis. National registries in Belarus and Ukraine catalogued exposed cohorts. Medical screening programs, including the now well-known thyroid screening for those who were children in 1986, uncovered cancers earlier and saved lives. The Chernobyl Tissue Bank was established to archive tumour samples for research. International funds, European Union grants, World Bank loans, the EBRD's financing helped to build a newer, safer confinement over the original hastily constructed sarcophagus. A gigantic steel arch, designed decades later to slide over the ruins and keep them contained. The new safe confinement was an engineering answer to an engineering disaster. It cost money, ingenuity, and long international cooperation. It is a necessary but not sufficient solution. It does not fix the soils and forests or erase the scars in people. Remediation strategies ranged from the surgical, removing the top few centimetres of soil around villages, to the simple and locally effective, advising people to stop drinking fresh milk and to avoid picking wild mushrooms. Potassium fertilizers and changes in animal feeding practices reduced uptake of cesium into foodstuffs. Large volumes of contaminated materials were collected and stored in hastily prepared repositories that themselves now require long-term oversight. In some places, entire towns and districts were depopulated. In others, life continued under a regime of monitoring and food controls. Sunflowers and other phytoremediating plants have been experimented with, and though they can extract certain isotopes from soils, they do not offer a rapid or complete solution. The complexity of the land and the persistence of cesium mean that, for some regions, living with enhanced restrictions and continuing surveillance is the only realistic plan. Decades on, the limits of scientific certainty remain a persistent fact. Scientists can catalogue the places with the highest contamination, the cohort of children with raised thyroid cancer incidence, and the cohort of emergency workers whose acute doses were medically recorded. They can model risk and project outcomes, but they cannot yet give every affected person an exact answer about whether their cancer, their fatigue, their hypertension stems from Chernobyl exposure or from a mix of life circumstances. Dose reconstruction for an individual who drank contaminated milk as a toddler in a village with poor records is an exercise in estimation. Epidemiology can say that at the population level certain risks are elevated. It cannot in all cases provide the neat attributable fraction for every illness in every person. The moral consequence of this scientific uncertainty is painfully human. Families seek compensation, nations seek recognition, and scientists offer probabilities where certainty is desired. The story of the radiation and the environment cannot be told only through isotopes and numbers. It has been shaped by human decisions about what to disclose and when, by timetables of evacuation and sheltering, and by the scale of mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, soldiers, miners, convicts, were mobilized to contain the damage, to pour concrete and install pumps and to clear the contaminated woodlands. They left their own footprints in the morbidity statistics, and many received inadequate protection for the tasks they performed. Entire communities were uprooted. The evacuation of Pripyat, the nearby workers' city with an initial population of roughly 50,000, was hurried and organized by bus the day after the blast. 30-kilometre exclusion zones were declared and later expanded. Over the course of months and years, several 100,000 people were resettled from contaminated territories. The logistical problems were enormous, housing people in new towns, rebuilding livelihoods, figuring out pensions and compensation for those now deemed unfit to work. The slow and bureaucratic nature of many of these responses magnified individual suffering, an administrative harm built on top of the material one. If radiation was an invisible weather, secrecy was a suffocating cloak. The Soviet government's initial response was shaped by habits that had been part of the state's practice for decades. contain information, limit public panic, and maintain the scripted image of competence. The first public acknowledgements were cautious and delayed. The world learned of the event not because Moscow announced it immediately, but because foreign monitoring stations detected something unusual. It was the Swedish Nuclear Safety Authority, alarmed by spikes in radiation at the Forsmark nuclear plant and by readings on meteorological monitoring devices on the 28th of April, who first called the attention of the international community to the possibility of a major release. Scientists and officials in Stockholm traced back the plume through meteorological data and placed the origin beyond the western borders of the Soviet Union. When the Swedes asked the Soviet government for an explanation, the initial Soviet replies were evasive. The Swedish detection and public questions forced disclosure. The Soviet Union announced the accident to the world on the 28th of April, but that admission came 2 days after the explosion, 2 days in which contamination spread across Europe along weather lanes. That delay mattered not simply because it added to the human exposure in the days of iodine 1v1, but because it demonstrated the limits of a governance culture that prized secrecy over transparency. Governments in Scandinavia, in Western Europe, and in the global south received fragments of information and then scrambled to assemble better pictures. There was an urgent international scramble for data. What isotopes had been released? How much? Where had it settled? Multinational teams offered assistance and epidemiologists asked to see the medical records that could not be produced in tidy form. Offers came from many places: equipment from the United States and other Western nations, detection support from Norway and Sweden, medical expertise from many corners of Europe. For days and weeks the air hummed with diplomatic activity, phone calls, démarches, and a new insistence that atomic accidents did not respect borders and could not be managed in secrecy. The diplomatic and bureaucratic consequences were immediate. Within months, the International Atomic Energy Agency and member states rushed to create a legal framework that would reduce the chance of such secrecy in the future. 2 international conventions were quickly drafted and adopted in 1986, one on early notification of a nuclear accident and another on assistance in the case of a nuclear accident or radiological emergency. The message was blunt and new. Countries must inform each other of accidents that could have transboundary consequences and must be prepared to assist. International cooperation on nuclear safety expanded. The IAEA's peer review and safety missions became routine. Inspectors moved across borders more freely. The accident taught the world a lesson in humility and interdependence. In an age of airborne toxins and fast weather, national isolation was no protection. The diplomatic fallout also did damage to Soviet credibility. The rhetoric of modernity that Moscow had cultivated, an image of rational, efficient industrial mastery, was dented by reports of poor documentation, confused evacuations, and bureaucratic spin. Western capitals and publics, watching the televised images of abandoned Pripyat and the bewildered faces of displaced families, recalibrated their assessments of Soviet competence. A system that had boasted the managerial capacity to tame nature had shown a catastrophic blind spot. The Soviet leadership's initial reluctance to provide timely information eroded trust in those same institutions in the eyes of foreign governments, and crucially in the eyes of Soviet citizens themselves. Within Moscow, the event widened fault lines that Mikhail Gorbachev had already been trying to address through his twin projects of Glasnost and Perestroika. The accident became both a practical and a symbolic argument for openness. Practically, it was impossible to negotiate the transboundary consequences of a radioactive plume without sharing information. The Soviet state was compelled to let outside scientists into restricted areas and, in some measure, to accept international scrutiny. Symbolically, Chernobyl was a demonstration of the cost of secrecy. Stories began to leak of misreported exposures, of workers ordered back into hot zones, of bureaucrats delaying evacuations. Scientists like Valery Legasov, an inorganic chemist who became a visible figure associated with the investigative commission, pushed to bring the technical truth into the daylight. Legasov's revelations, his insistence on connecting operational errors and reactor design flaws, and his growing willingness to speak to colleagues abroad made him, for many, both a source of technical clarity and a moral witness. His later suicide in 1988 has been read as a tragic personal seal on the failures he described. Whether read as martyrdom or as the end of an exhausted life, it deepened the moral resonance of the disaster. The immediate political fallout within the Communist Party was a choreography of blame and containment. Plant managers and engineers, Viktor Bryukhanov, Nikolai Fomin and Nataly Dyatlov among them, were put on trial in 1987 and convicted on charges connected to gross violations of safety. Their prosecutions were simultaneously an assertion of accountability and a diversion from systemic responsibility. The trials gave the leadership a visible way to punish errors, but they did not fully satisfy a public that had begun to suspect that the blame was not only in the individual actions of a few men, but in a system that rewarded production quotas and bowed to political timetables. Public confidence in technical and managerial competence ebbed. Glasnost found in Chernobyl an amplifier. Journalists used the loosening restraints to report on the accident, to tell stories of families uprooted, to investigate the hidden expenses of the cleanup, and to question officials, environmental groups newly formed, operating in an atmosphere that was marginally less repressive than before, picked up the themes and turned them into political demands. Citizens who had once been taught to equate the party's authority with safe health and modern living saw that the equation was false. The result was not immediate revolution, but it was a shift in the public mood. When nationalists and democratic reformers later marshalled grievances against Moscow, they found sympathy in communities whose lives had been altered by invisible fallout and bureaucratic indifference. Chernobyl, in other words, acted as a concrete demonstration of systemic brittleness. It was not simply the reactor that was flawed, but the chain of authority that mismanaged it. This erosion of trust fed into the broader processes that were already weakening the Soviet state. Gorbachev had launched reforms intended to revitalize the economy and to unbind political life from ossified central control. Chernobyl complicated those reforms by undermining the legitimacy of the institutions that would be tasked with carrying them out. Where glasnost had been sold as a policy restore public faith by bringing truth into light, the truths revealed by Chernobyl, stories of negligence, suppression, bureaucratic inertia, accelerated public dissatisfaction. The party found itself having to defend both its prerogatives and its failures. Each new revelation, each newly published set of statistics about contamination or misplaced compensation made the task harder. In the Republican capitals, the accident gave voice to local grievances. In Minsk and Kiev, in Vilnius and Riga, environmental catastrophe became a political narrative that meshed with ethnic and economic demands. People who were told to be proud of Soviet technological achievement looked at ruined villages and sick children and asked for explanations, redress, and power. Movements that had once been confined to cultural spheres now claimed political legitimacy on the strength of environmental justice. Chernobyl was not the only cause of rising nationalism or democratic agitation, but it was an accelerant. The policies that later led to the independence of republics and the unravelling of the Soviet Union had many causes, and Chernobyl must be counted among them. An environmental and administrative shock that fed the broader disillusionment with a system that had promised so much and, in a single weekend of radiation, shown such fallibility. If one seeks a single sentence to sum the political lesson, it might read, "The secrecy which was supposed to protect the state ended up exposing it." That is a paradox neatly suited to a bedtime parable. The Soviet state had long treated information as a strategic asset, best hoarded, rationed, and deployed. Chernobyl demonstrated that for some hazards, information itself is a public good and that withholding it can multiply harm. The international conventions that followed were not merely about nuclear engineering. They were about the political culture of transparency. The new safe confinement that later covered the ruin of reactor number 4 was a technological answer. Glasnost and the political agitation it released was the social one. The final slow motion of these events is not dramatic in the way of single moments of rupture. It is the quiet unspooling of confidence, the slow redistribution of authority, the new insistence by citizens that government must not only rule, but justify. Chernobyl did not cause the fall of the Soviet Union by itself. It did not topple the wall around the Kremlin in a single night. But it was a stain on the narrative of competence that the Soviet state had tried to maintain. It showed that assumptions about industrial progress and centralized management had limits. It lent moral force to demands for openness, accountability, and local control. It made visible, in a way that speeches could not, the human and environmental costs of policy and secrecy. When you close your eyes and try to imagine the arc from a reactor core in '86 to the political transformations that followed, picture the invisible plume as a moral tracer. It lit up not just fields and forests, but the pathways of governance and the possibilities of dissent. The red forest stood as a literal and symbolic burned patch, a concentrated ruin everyone could point to. The slow, persistent leaks of information that followed, and the reorganizations and reforms they prompted, were less immediately dramatic but deeper in consequence. Scientists and physicians continue to work the problem as if reading a long, complicated case file. International bodies continue to produce reports that tighten our estimates and widen our understanding. And the people of Ukraine, Belarus and Russia have lived the consequences, socially, economically, medically, ever since. In the half-light of these decades, we see both the utility and the limitation of technical certainty. We can, with increasing accuracy, say what isotopes travelled where, how many children develop thyroid cancers, which workers received lethal doses, which forests still carry unacceptable levels of cesium. We can say that the Soviet policy of suppression delayed protective measures and likely increased health burdens in certain cohorts. Beyond that lie the shaded rims of probability, the long tail of low-dose risk, the psychosocial burdens of displacement, the erosion of institutional credibility. Chernobyl remains a lesson in both physical and political stewardship. The physical remediation required engineering, biology, and patience. The political remedy demanded openness, institutional reform, and an acceptance that citizens have a right to know. The two are not separate. The hands that build the sarcophagus also need the light of scrutiny. The same invisible weather that ruined landscapes also cleared the air for new conversations about what governance, in a modern state, ought to mean. And so the story winds slowly onward, a silent release that became a loud question, a damaged landscape that demanded technical repair, and a political system that discovered to its cost that secrecy can be a hazard no less lethal than unstable graphite. In the aftermath, as in the nights after a storm, people counted losses and measures and began, cautiously and with imperfect tools, to rebuild trust as well as towns. The work continues. The instruments keep singing their tiny alarms. The forests keep their slow book of fallout. The debates about numbers and responsibility keep scholars awake. It is perhaps the historian's most melancholic comfort that even the slow lessons of catastrophe can be learned, that from the radium dust and the bureaucratic dust there come changes, often painful, sometimes corrective, that alter the shape of nations and the habits of power. When the first images of smoke and a burning graphite core travelled beyond the Iron Curtain on April 28, 1986, 2 days after the explosion, they collided with an already fracturing world of rumour and secrecy. Secrecy seeded myth. Silence fertilised rumour. A biological image, an ungraspable poison invisible to the eye, needed stories to make sense of itself. And stories arrive more quickly than measurement. The apocalyptic version was irresistibly simple. An entire country felled by invisible death. Landscapes turned to theatres of mutant monsters. A continent condemned by an accident. It made for memorable headlines. It made for good nightmares. The first area I want you to settle into softly is the difference between sensational narrative and the laborious, careful work of science. Science is patient, insistently slow, and it arrives with numbers that are provisional and hedged. Myths come roaring in with tidy totals and villains. The most persistent myth about Chernobyl is the one about the death count. A single, absolute number that could be branded onto a headline forever. Early Soviet statements were sparse and self-protective. The wider world, waiting with a mixture of curiosity and dread, supplied its own arithmetic. In truth, the immediate human toll was tragic and focused. Firefighters and plant workers who stood within meters of the overheating core, engineers who entered unknown nightmares without adequate protection, men who bled into the hospital wards with what would be diagnosed as acute radiation syndrome. By the end of the summer of 1986, the Soviet authorities and later international teams documented a few dozen deaths directly attributable to the high doses received in those first hours and days. The exact tally depends on definitions: who is counted as an on-the-spot casualty, who is recorded later as a consequence, but it's not the 100,000 plus body count that some accounts have insisted upon. That matters because the measure of harm conditions the kind of response that follows. When the United Nations agencies UNCER, IAEA, WHO, and allied scientific bodies gathered their evidence in the years after the disaster, they reached a restrained conclusion. Thousands, not hundreds of thousands, of excess deaths could be expected among the most heavily exposed groups across decades, particularly from cancers that may trace their origins to the event. The Chernobyl Forum's report of 2005, the product of joint UN agency review, suggested up to around 4,000 eventual deaths among the emergency workers and highly exposed populations, if one accepts the epidemiological models it used. That number is not comforting. It is smaller than the most lurid claims, and it is still a grave, avoidable human cost that required, and still requires, careful compensation, medical follow-up, and social support. And then there are the competing numbers, studies and reports, some published in peer-reviewed journals, some not, that use different mathematical assumptions about how low-dose radiation increases cancer risk. Some activists and NGOs using linear extrapolation from observed high-dose effects to hypothetical low-dose risks across massive populations have suggested tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of eventual deaths. These estimates are methodologically defensible within a particular framework. If one assumes the linear no-threshold model for every dose, applied across the millions who receive trivial amounts of contamination, but they're also politically useful. They emphasize catastrophe, they press for broader assistance, and they compel action. Science allows these debates. Such debates are not conspiracies. They are arguments about models, about risk transfer, about how to weigh uncertainty when lives hang in the balance. Another myth demands an even gentler debunking, because it traffics in images more than numbers. The idea that Chernobyl birthed a new generation of visibly monstrous children, that mutation had become a cinematic spectacle. The photographs of grotesque deformity circulated in the weeks and years after the accident, capsules of horror that fed public imagination and fed into pre-existing narratives about radiation and mutation that date back to Hiroshima and to Cold War fears. The truth is more complex and less sensational. There is strong peer-reviewed evidence of a dramatic increase in thyroid cancer among those exposed as children to iodine-131, particularly in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Russian territories bordering the site. Thousands of cases have been recorded since the late 1980s. Many were detected early because of enhanced screening programs and, crucially, are amenable to treatment. That rise in thyroid disease is among the most unequivocal health consequences of the disaster. It tied directly to a well-understood mechanism. Radioiodine concentrates in the thyroid. Children drank contaminated milk. And it is a concrete testimony to what we now call avoidable harm. But beyond that, broad claims of a surge in congenital malformations across entire populations, or of widespread genetic damage manifesting as legible physiological monstrosities in offspring, lack the solid epidemiological backbone to support them. Studies looking at birth defects, population-level infant mortality, and genetic markers have generally failed to find consistent population-wide increases attributable to radiation, though some localized clusters have been reported and remain the subject of ongoing research. The reason for the uncertainty is partly scientific. Detecting subtle changes above the background noise of birth defects and cancer is technically difficult, and partly social. The collapse of social services, economic dislocation, stigma and stress all produce health effects and patterns of morbidity that are not radiological in origin but are interwoven with the disaster. Fear itself became a vector of harm. Fear drew its own gallery of images, the Red Forest, where pine needles browned and fell like burnt confetti, the Ferris wheel in Pripyat frozen mid-rotation, toys in empty infant classrooms. Photographs are vivid, and the mind invites narrative. A dead wood, an abandoned teddy bear, these are symbols. They are also selective evidence. Local ecologies are not simple mirrors of radiation exposure. When humans leave, other dynamics enter. Suppressed agricultural activity, changed predator-prey relationships, a landscape of recomposition, where wildlife sometimes returns with surprising abundance, albeit under a cloud of contamination that cannot be wished away. A wolf may prowl the exclusion zone and be photographed at leisure. That image can be used to tell a story of nature's resilience or one of nature's mutation. Both are seductive. Both are partial. Conspiracy theories fit into this ecosystem of image and fear like an invasive vine. Secret files, classified tests the Soviet state's reflex to conceal, these were real. The state's behavior underlined its own culpability. When the Soviet leadership delayed evacuation orders for the town of Pripyat, and when it delayed notification of international bodies until alarm was raised in Sweden, the vacuum was filled by rumour. Conspiracy is the brain's default when transparency collapses. So stories of intentional cover-ups proliferate, and some of them are based on kernels of truth, mismanagement, misplaced priorities, a system organised to deny error. But not every secret implies a global malevolent plot. Historical analysis privileges causation over a single grand design. The accident resulted from a confluence: design weaknesses in the RBMK reactor, a positive void coefficient, graphite tips on control rods, operational errors during a botched safety test on the night of April 25-26, 1986, and a culture that discouraged full candour about failure. Those elements are sober, useful facts. They explain why the reactor became a hazard without needing to posit a cabal that intended catastrophe. If we're to understand why misinformation took hold and endured, we must also look at how memory works. Memory grafts the spectacular onto the ordinary. It amplifies certain images while erasing others. A photograph of a firefighter in a blackened helmet is more sticky than a table of dosimetry readings. The media's appetite for narrative economy meant that simple, terrifying stories fared better than slow scientific arguments. Human beings are not statistical creatures by inclination. We are story animals. That is why myth-making matters politically and materially. It shapes compensation, drives policy, and fixes reputations. When a government hears the world believes that hundreds of thousands have died, its calculations change. When donors and judges face haunting images, they allocate money differently. Some victims receive help. Others become subjects of suspicion. In Belarus and Ukraine, the bureaucracies that emerged, categories of liquidator, victim of the disaster, resident of a contaminated zone, were as much social instruments as they were medical classifications. People whose incomes collapsed or whose homes had become worthless sought recognition in order to receive pensions and medical benefits. That pursuit sometimes produced fraud and sometimes produced injustice when the state refused claims. Myth and reality braided together to make new social facts. And yet, for all the missteps in narrative, some claims remained legitimately open among scholars. The tally of long-term excess cancer deaths is a debate shaped by models and values. How to treat low-dose exposures, how to allocate causation in complex epidemiological landscapes, how to weigh individual attribution against population risk. The ecological effects on flora and fauna reveal a similarly recalcitrant ambiguity. Some studies point to elevated mutation rates in specific species, others emphasize the ecological liberation produced by human absence. Methodological difficulties, Small sample sizes, confounding variables, changing land use mean that many claims stay contested. That uncertainty should not be read as a cover-up or a failure of science. It is the ordinary condition of knowledge in the aftermath of a large, messy technological rupture. When stories of radiation crossed into literature and film, they did not always obey the gentle logic of peer review. They obeyed memory and emotion. Svetlana Alexievich's Voices from Chernobyl, published in Russian in 1997 and later translated into English as Chernobyl Prayer, collected the polyphonic testimony of evacuees, liquidators, and physicians. Her book is not epidemiology. It is an act of witness, a chorus of personal memory that gives face and voice to what statistics risk making abstract. It won attention because it insisted on the human dimension that radiation cannot capture in a spreadsheet. Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl, 2019, returned the story to historical narrative, meticulously reconstructing events and decisions and making the machinery of the accident comprehensible at human scale. The plant director Viktor Bryukhanov, the deputy engineer Anatoly Dyatlov desperately pressing buttons, the scientist Valery Legasov, who later testified and left a tragic, ambiguous legacy. Legasov's story, an earnest, flawed man who recorded damning assessments and who later took his own life, was dramatised in Craig Mazin's 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl. The series reached millions, and with millions of viewers come both a wider sympathy and a new set of choices about accuracy. Mazin conflated and compressed characters, invented a composite heroine in the scientist Ulana Khomyuk, and took liberties for dramatic economy. The series captured the moral architecture of the story, the failures of bureaucracy, the courage of specific individuals, the costs of lying, but it also simplified and streamlined. That is what drama does. It makes a shape for cognition. It is not evidence. Documentary filmmakers, photographers, and poets made different choices. Gerd Ludwig photographed the radiation-scarred landscapes and the people who remained, producing images that entered both scientific discussions and gallery displays. Marianne DeLeo's short film Chernobyl Heart, which won an Academy Award, focused on the children in Gomel afflicted with cardiac ailments, a story that galvanized aid but also invited critics who argued that film compressed complex realities. The Babushkas of Chernobyl, a documentary about elderly women who returned illegally to their homes inside the exclusion zone, posed ethical questions about romanticizing resilience. Is a camera's frame that shows a smiling old woman harvesting vegetables in a cordoned pasture capturing courage or participating in spectacle? Often both. The moral responsibility of artists working with victims is not to produce a single definitive truth, but to ensure dignity, consent, and context. Always context. Local commemoration practices built their own counter-narratives. In Pripyat, small crosses mark graves. In Minsk and Kiev, there are monuments to the liquidators. Churches hold annual memorial services on April 26th. The Chernobyl Way protests that began in Belarus in the late 80s used the disaster as a rallying point for political change. A civic memory weaponized against secrecy and state neglect. Memory politics is never neutral. In Belarus, the catastrophe became part of a national conversation about vulnerability and accountability. In Ukraine, it was woven into narratives of Soviet failure. Across the West, it fed anti-nuclear movements and reframed risk. Meanwhile, a quieter, stranger memory took root in the exclusion zone itself. Elderly people who returned illegally, the Samozli, tend small plots, mend fences, live with radiation exposure because home, for them, has a pull that official categories cannot quantify. Their presence complicates the neat division between evacuated landscape and preservation area. It dramatizes the human difficulty of leaving place behind. There is an ethical shadow in the commodification of memory. Dark tourism, the sale of guided tours into the 30-kilometre exclusion zone, the selfies before rusted Russian signs, the saged danger photos in schoolrooms, turns solemn history into an Instagram backdrop. Some guide companies are careful, others trade on the aura of risk. The zone has become an economic asset for a struggling region and a moral puzzle for those who remember the cost of the dislocation. Is it exploitation when a local guide earns an income showing the world a destroyed town? Or is it survivance, a new livelihood from a landscape their ancestors once nourished? The answer is both, and the tension is normal. Art and memory are not innocent. They participate in recovery and in erasure at once. This moves us naturally toward lessons, the practical ones that engineers, policymakers, and societies should carry forward. Technical reform followed Chernobyl with a long, patient logic. The RBMK reactors were not simply inherently unsafe. They were designed with trade-offs: ability to refuel online, huge graphite moderators, and a positive void coefficient that made certain transient conditions dangerous. After the accident, the Soviet nuclear establishment initiated an extensive retrofit program. Control rods were redesigned to eliminate graphite tips that produced a transient reactivity spike on insertion. Automatic shutdown systems were improved. Operational rules were rewritten. Instrumentation was standardized. Emergency core cooling and containment philosophies were re-evaluated. Those changes reduced the particular vulnerabilities of RBMKs. Some reactors were closed, others continued to operate under modified rules. The world learned to pay attention to how design choices trade efficiency for safety margins. Internationally, the legal and institutional architecture of nuclear safety evolved. In the months after Chernobyl, the IAEA shepherded the adoption of the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident and the Convention on Assistance in the case of a nuclear accident or radiological emergency, both in late 1986, creating mechanisms so states could and should inform one another quickly when accidents occurred. The World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO, founded in 1989, became a forum for peer review and exchange between operators. The Convention on Nuclear Safety, a later instrument, pushed for transparent regulatory frameworks and independent oversight. The Chernobyl Forum itself, convened in the 2000s, showed how multilateral scientific assessment could produce a shared baseline for public policy, even if disagreement on models remained. Slowly, a web of international norms and peer review grew that made global cooperation more plausible. But institutions are vessels, not infallible remedies. The disaster taught a broader lesson about culture. Technical safety depends on social practices. The culture inside a plant, the willingness of engineers to speak up, the independence of regulators from political pressure, the incentives that reward safety over production, matters more than any single bolt. The Soviet tendency to privilege productivity, to penalize bad news, to centralize authority without local accountability amplified technical risk. Since Chernobyl, countries have emphasized safety culture in training, in independent regulation, and in the cultivation of whistleblower protections. Safety is organizational and moral before it is a blueprint. Emergency preparedness changed in kind and in scale. European radiation monitoring networks were reinforced, international communications protocols improved, and authorities formalized zones of evacuation and sheltering. The painful lesson that early sheltering and distribution of stable iodine could have reduced thyroid doses among children translated into public health protocols in many countries. Emergency exercises became more common. Governments now aim to rehearse worst-case scenarios rather than deny their possibility. Energy policy, however, remains a contest of narratives. In the immediate aftermath of Chernobyl, several countries and publics turned decisively away from nuclear power. Italy voted to close its reactors in 1987. Germany's anti-nuclear movement gained political traction that would reverberate for decades. Yet in the long view, the calculus shifts when another narrative overlays the first: climate change. Nuclear power's low greenhouse gas emissions make it attractive to those who worry that an energy transition without nuclear will fail to decarbonize quickly enough. Chernobyl did not create a binary choice, though it sharpened the costs and risks we must weigh. The lesson again is procedural. Avoid secrecy, ensure independent regulation, invest in redundancy, and build political consent for whatever energy path the society chooses. The social and political legacies of the disaster still press on the living. Hundreds of thousands were relocated. The precise numbers depend on counting methods, but tens of thousands were resettled immediately, and in the years after the Soviet collapse, hundreds of thousands received some form of assistance as affected by Chernobyl. The liquidators, men and women called up from across the Soviet Union to bury, to armour, to pour concrete and sand, to decontaminate roofs and fields, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Belarus, Ukraine and Russia instituted pension and medical programs for attorneys and workers, but they often proved inadequate, bureaucratically complex, and sometimes subject to corruption. In the post-Soviet economic collapse, the safety nets frayed. That is not a radiation fact, it is an institutional one, about how states manage catastrophe, and about who inherits a ruined administrative apparatus. A final quiet lesson for any society contemplating high-consequence technologies is moral rather than technical. We must ask how to distribute risk and benefit, how to care for those unlucky enough to be harmed, and how to speak truth to the public without producing panic. Technicians can build redundancy, regulators can demand it, politicians must not substitute spin for reality. Scientists need to explain uncertainty without abdicating responsibility. Journalists must avoid the siren song of spectacle. Citizens must be taught enough numeracy to understand degrees of risk without being flattered by apocalyptic certainties. These are not new prescriptions. They are the oldest of political tasks. Honesty, competence, compassion. There is a final physical memory. The sarcophagus that the Soviets built in 1986 to entomb Reactor 4 and the new safe confinement arch slid into place in November 2016 with international funding coordinated through the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development's Chernobyl Shelter Fund. The arch is the practical answer, to shield workers from crumbling concrete and to provide a long-term containment to allow for cleanup. It is also a symbol of how engineering can contain, if slowly and cooperatively, what once spiraled out of control. Around it, the exclusion zone remains a palimpsest, nature returning, infrastructures collapsing, social memories layering like dust on playground equipment. So the disaster's true completeness is not in a tidy single number, or in a gallery of monsters. It is in the messy, persistent afterlife, contested epidemiology, the slow building of international norms, the artistic production that insists we remember the voices of the displaced, the bureaucratic negotiations over pensions, and the slow technical remediation that required the cooperation of dozens of countries. If one lesson sounds quiet and persistent, it is this. Complex technological systems fail in ways that are not wholly technical. They fail across organizations, across cultures, and across narratives. A safer future demands that we fix bolts and circuits, yes, but also that we fix incentives, cultivate candor, and care for truth when it is inconvenient. Lie back and think for a long moment of all the small human habits that the disaster interrupted. The milking of cows in a private yard, the ringing of a school bell, the smell of bread from a communal oven, and imagine the patient arithmetic of recovery that stitched those lives back into some shape. Recovery is neither heroic nor cinematic, it is administrative, prosaic and long. It requires monitoring stations that hum, doctors who keep tasting charts and scanning thyroids, pension clerks who pull files, and neighbours who accept neighbours again. None of these things is glamorous. They are nonetheless the only true armour against the most tenacious of myths, the myth that catastrophe absolves societies of the slow work of repair. The world that learned from Chernobyl is a world with stricter drills and more watchers, with conventions signed in Geneva and sombre meetings in Vienna, with operatives who can call one another across borders and share dosimetry logs when a plume drifts. It is also a world that must live with uncertainty, about cancer models, about ecological consequences, about how memory will twist tragedy into political capital or moral reckoning. The hazard of forgetting is as real as the hazard of contamination. Memory can be a tool for better safety, or a lever for stunted conversation. And so the final image is not the Ferris wheel. Though it is beautiful, it is a small steady light in a distant watchtower, the low lamp in a control room somewhere in a reactor hall where someone has learned to speak up when the numbers look strange, where an independent regulator reads the reports with steady skepticism, where communities are consulted before decisions that will affect their children. That small steady lamp is both a technological and a civic device. It requires engineers who know their craft and citizens who insist on accountability. It requires doctors who can say, without theatricality, what is and is not known. It requires artists who will not flatten a life to an icon. The Chernobyl nightmare was real enough. Its myths deserve to be peeled apart, not to strip suffering of its dignity, but to make room for the precise interventions that prevent further harm. We tend the facts, we tend the memories, and with both hands we build frameworks that are robust enough to hold against both catastrophe and myth, against both the rupture of machines and the rupture of trust. Only then can the long shadow finally become, if not always narrow, at least illuminated,